The culture of Turkey combines a heavily diverse and heterogeneous set of elements that have been derived from the various cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean region and, to a lesser degree, Southeastern European, Caucasian, and Central Asian traditions. Many of these traditions were initially brought together by the Ottoman Empire, a multi-ethnic and multi-religious state. The present-day Republic of Turkey, which was declared in 1923 after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, is still a transcontinental country that spans Europe and Asia. During the early years of the Republic, the government invested a large amount of resources into fine arts such as paintings, sculpture and architecture. This was done as both a process of modernization and of creating a cultural identity. Because of the different historical factors defining the Turkish identity, the culture of Turkey combines clear efforts of modernization and westernization undertaken in varying degrees since the 1700s, with a simultaneous desire to maintain traditional religious and historical values. People. Turkish culture has undergone profound changes over the last century. Today, Turkey may be the only country that contains every extreme of Eastern and Western culture. The Ottoman system was a multi-ethnic state that enabled people within it not to mix with each other and thereby retained separate ethnic and religious identities within the empire. Upon the fall of the empire after World War I, the Turkish Republic adapted a unitary approach, which forced all the different cultures within its borders to mix with each other with the aim of producing Turkish national and cultural identity. This mixing, instead of producing cultural homogenization, instead resulted in many shades of grey as the traditional Muslim cultures of Anatolia collided with the cosmopolitan modernity of Istanbul and the wider West. Literature. Turkish literature is the collection of written and oral texts composed in the Turkish language, either in its Ottoman form or in less exclusively literary forms, such as that spoken in the Republic of Turkey today. Traditional examples for Turkish folk literature include the stories of Karagoth and Hasavat, Keleglan, İncili Kavis and Nasreddin Hoca, as well as the works of folk poets such as Yunus Emre and Asik Veysel. The Book of Dede Korkut and the Epic of Koroglu have been the main elements of the Turkish epic tradition in Anatolia for several centuries. The two primary streams of Ottoman literature were poetry and prose. Of the two, the Ottoman Divan poetry, a highly ritualized and symbolic art form, was the dominant stream. The vast majority of Divan poetry was lyric in nature, either ghazals or qasides. There were, however, other common genres, most particularly the mesnevi, a kind of verse romance and thus a variety of narrative poetry. The tradition of Ottoman prose was exclusively non-fictional in nature, as the fiction tradition was limited to narrative poetry. The Tanzimat reforms of 1839 to 1876 brought changes to the language of Ottoman written literature, and introduced previously unknown Western genres, primarily the novel and the short story. Many of the writers in the Tanzimat period wrote in several different genres simultaneously. For instance, the poet Namik Kemal also wrote the important 1876 novel Intibar, while the journalist Sanazi is noted for writing, in 1860, the first modern Turkish play, the one-act comedy, Serevlim Meşi. Most of the roots of modern Turkish literature were formed between the years 1896 and 1923. Broadly, there were three primary literary movements during this period: the Edebiyat movement, the Fekrat movement, and the Milli Edebiyat movement. The Edebiyat movement began with the founding in 1891 of the magazine Servet Hayfunan, which was largely devoted to progress along the Western model. Accordingly, the magazine's literary ventures, under the direction of the poet Tevfik Fikret, were geared towards creating a Western-style, high art, in Turkey. Poetry is the most dominant form of literature in modern Turkey. The folk poetry, as indicated above, was strongly influenced by the Islamic Sunni and Shia traditions. Furthermore, as partly evidenced by the prevalence of the still existent Asik, or Zan tradition, the dominant element in Turkish folk poetry has always been song. The development of folk poetry in Turkish, which began to emerge in the 13th century with such important writers as Yunus Emre, Sultan Veld, and Seyyad Hamza, was given a great boost when, on 13 May 1277, Karamanoglu Mehmet Bey declared Turkish the official state language of Anatolia's powerful Karamanid state, for, subsequently, many of the tradition's greatest poets would continue to emerge from this region. There are, broadly speaking, two traditions of Turkish folk poetries: the Asik, or Zan tradition, which, although much influenced by religion, as mentioned above, was for the most part a secular tradition; the explicitly religious tradition, which emerged from the gathering places of the Sufi religious orders and Shia groups. Much of the poetry and song of the Asik, or Zan tradition, being almost exclusively oral until the 19th century, remains anonymous. There are, however, a few well-known Asiks from before that time whose names have survived together with their works. The aforementioned Koroglu, Karasalglan, who may be the best known of the pre-19th century Asiks; Dardarloglu, who was one of the last of the great Asiks before the tradition began to dwindle somewhat in the late 19th century, and several others. The Asiks were essentially minstrels who traveled through Anatolia performing their songs on the baglama, a mandolin-like instrument whose paired strings are considered to have a symbolic religious significance in Alevi, Bektashi culture. Despite the decline of the Asik, or Zan tradition in the 19th century, it experienced a significant revival in the 20th century thanks to such outstanding figures as Asik Vasil Satayaglu, Asik Marzuni Serif, Nesit Hurtas, and many others. Ottoman Divan poetry was a highly ritualized and symbolic art form. From the Persian poetry that largely inspired it, it inherited a wealth of symbols whose meanings and interrelationships, both of similitude and opposition, were more or less prescribed. Examples of prevalent symbols that, to some extent, oppose one another include, among others, the nightingale, the rose, the world, the rose garden, the ascetic, the dervish. In the early years of the Republic of Turkey, there were a number of poetic trends. Authors such as Ahmed Hassam and Yahya Kemal Bayatla continued to write important formal verse whose language was, to a great extent, a continuation of the late Ottoman tradition. By far the majority of the poetry of the time, however, was in the tradition of the folk-inspired, syllabist movement, which had emerged from the national literature movement and which tended to express patriotic themes couched in the syllabic meter associated with Turkish folk poetry. The first radical step away from this trend was taken by Nazim Hikmet, who, during his time as a student in the Soviet Union from 1921 to 1924, was exposed to the modernist poetry of Vladimir Mayakovsky and others, which inspired him to start writing verse in a less formal style. Another revolution in Turkish poetry came about in 1941 with the publication of a small volume of verse preceded by an essay and entitled Garip. The authors were Orhan Veli Kanik, Melih Cevdet Andi, and Oktay Rifat, explicitly opposing themselves to everything that had gone in poetry before. They sought instead to create a popular art, to explore the people's tastes, to determine them, and to make them reign supreme over art. 21. To this end, and inspired in part by contemporary French poets like Jacques Prévert, they employed not only a variant of the free verse introduced by Nazim Hikmet, but also highly colloquial language, and wrote primarily about mundane daily subjects and the ordinary man on the street. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Most of the academic establishment and older poets vilified him, while much of the Turkish population embraced him wholeheartedly. Just as the Garip movement was a reaction against earlier poetry, so, in the 1950s and afterwards, was there a reaction against the Garip movement. The poets of this movement, soon known as Ik and Yeni, oppose themselves to the social aspects prevalent in the poetry of Nazim Hikmet and the Garip poets, and instead, partly inspired by the disruption of language in such Western movements as Dada and Surrealism, sought to create a more abstract poetry, through the use of jarring and unexpected language, complex images, and the association of ideas. To some extent, the movement can be seen as bearing some of the characteristics of postmodern literature. The best-known poets writing in the second new vein were Turgut Uyar, Edip Canver, Semel Şuraya, İlhan, and İlhan Berk. Outside of the Garipan second new movements also, a number of significant poets have flourished, such as Faisal Husnu Daglakar, who wrote poems dealing with fundamental concepts like life, death, God, time, and the cosmos. Beset Nekatijal, whose somewhat allegorical poems explore the significance of middle-class daily life. Can Yücel, who, in addition to his own highly colloquial and varied poetry, was also a translator into Turkish of a variety of world literature, and İsmet Özel, whose early poetry was highly leftist but whose poetry since the 1970s has shown a strong mystical and even Islamist influence. Prose. The style of the current novelists can be traced back to the Young Pens journal in the Ottoman period. Young Pens was published in Selanik under Ömer Seyfettin Ziya Gökalp Ali Kanap Yontam. They covered the social and political concepts of their time with the nationalistic perspective. They were the core of a movement which became known as the national literature, with the declaration of the Turkish Republic in 1923. Turkish literature became interested in folkloric styles. This was also the first time since the 19th century that Turkish literature was escaping from Western influence and began to mix Western forms with other forms. During the 1930s, Yakup Kadri Karagöz Maniglu and Vedat Nedim Tor published Kadro, which was revolutionary in its view of life. Stylistically, the early prose of the Republic of Turkey was essentially a continuation of the national literature movement, with realism and naturalism predominating. This trend culminated in the 1932 novel Yaban by Yakup Kadri Karagöz Maniglu. This novel can be seen as the precursor to two trends that would soon develop: social realism, and the village novel. The social realist movement was led by the short story writer Sait Faik Abasayanik. The major writers of the village novel tradition were Kemal Tahir, Orhan Kemal, and Yazar Kemal, in a very different tradition, but evincing a similar strong political viewpoint, was the satirical short story writer Aziz Nesin. Other important novelists of this period were Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar and Agazete. Orhan Pamuk, winner of the 2006 Nobel Prize in Literature, is among the innovative novelists whose works show the influence of postmodernism and magic realism. Important poets of the Republic of Turkey period include Ahmet Hassam, Yahya Kemal Beyatlı and Nazim Hikmet. Orhan Veli Kanık, Melih Cevdet Ande and Oktay Rifat led the Garip movement, while Turgut Uyar, Edip Canver and Semel Şuraya led the Ik and Yeni movement. Outside of the Garip and Ik and Yeni movements, a number of other significant poets such as Faisal Husnu Daglakar, Beset Nekatijal and Can Yücel also flourished. Orhan Pamuk is a leading Turkish novelist of postmodern literature. His works have been translated into more than 20 languages. He is the recipient of major Turkish and international literary awards, such as the 2006 Nobel Prize in Literature.